He didn't win you over with confidence. He won you over with pain. With the story he told late at night when his voice got quiet. With the moment he looked down and said, "I've never told anyone this." With the way he seemed almost ashamed, almost fragile, almost human. And you remember thinking, maybe not even in words, just in a feeling. Underneath everything, he's actually wounded. That belief didn't make you feel foolish. It made you feel loyal. It made you feel chosen, trusted, special. And then later, after the confusion, after the emotional whiplash, after the days you couldn't sleep because you were replaying everything, another question started forming in you. One you didn't want to ask because it felt cruel. Was that vulnerability real, or was it a hook? Because the most disorienting thing about narcissistic relationships is that the softness often feels like the most authentic part. The tears look real. The childhood story sounds real. The shame feels real. The "I'm scared you'll leave" moment feels real. And yet, somehow, that softness becomes the very thing that keeps you attached to someone who repeatedly harms you. So let's talk about how narcissists use vulnerability to create attachment, not in a way that turns you cynical, but in a way that gives you clarity. Because you don't need another label. You need your experiences to finally connect into a pattern. When a healthy person is vulnerable, vulnerability creates closeness because it comes with responsibility. It comes with a willingness to be known, to be accountable, to be reciprocal. But in narcissistic dynamics, vulnerability often shows up differently. It isn't offered to create mutual intimacy. It's offered to create emotional leverage. And that leverage is subtle because it doesn't feel like a weapon. It feels like a confession. It feels like a confession. It feels like he's letting you in. It feels like he's becoming safe. So you soften, you open, you invest. And you don't just invest in him, you invest in the story of him. The story that says he's hard sometimes, but it's because he's been hurt. The story that says, if I love him well enough, he'll finally relax. The story that says, if I stay, I can help him heal. That story is powerful for women who love deeply because it turns endurance into meaning. It makes the suffering feel like it has a purpose. But a narcissistic partner often uses vulnerability to create a specific kind of bond, not a bond rooted in mutual care, but a bond rooted in your empathy, because empathy is one of the easiest ways to bypass your boundaries. Think about how it usually starts. He shares something heavy earlier than most emotionally healthy people would. He tells you about betrayal, trauma, family pain, his ex who destroyed him. He makes you feel like you're the first person who truly understands him. And you may remember thinking, he's intense, but it's because he's sincere. That intensity doesn't just create closeness. It creates acceleration. It makes the connection feel faded, rare, different. It makes you feel responsible for the safety of the bond. Because once someone shares a wound, you don't want to hurt them. You don't want to hurt them. You don't want to abandon them. And narcissistic patterns understand this. Not always consciously like a plan, but instinctively like a survival style. If he can get you to bond to his pain, he can get you to tolerate his behavior. Because you stop judging his actions as actions. You start interpreting his actions as symptoms. When he withdraws, you think he's scared. When he lashes out, you think he's scared. When he lashes out, you think he's triggered. When he lies, you think he's ashamed. When he blames you, you think he's protecting himself. And the more you interpret him through his wounds, the more your reality disappears behind his. That's how vulnerability becomes attachment. Not because you were gullible, because you were compassionate. Now let's go deeper into what makes this pattern so sticky. Narcissistic vulnerability is often selective. He can cry about his childhood, but he can't sit with your pain without turning it around. He can confess how broken he is, but he can't take responsibility for what he did yesterday. He can talk for hours about how others hurt him, but becomes cold or defensive when you name how he hurt you. This selective vulnerability does something very confusing inside you. It gives you proof of a heart without giving you evidence of change. It makes you believe he's capable of depth while you're living with repeated emotional harm. So your mind splits him into two people: the wounded boy you want to protect and the man who keeps wounding you. And you keep thinking, if I can just reach the wounded boy, the man will stop hurting me. That's the attachment trap, because it makes you chase intimacy as if intimacy is the cure for disrespect. But disrespect isn't healed by your understanding. Disrespect is confronted by accountability, and accountability is exactly what narcissistic patterns avoid. So instead of accountability, you get vulnerability, a story, a tear, a confession, a promise, and your nervous system reads that as closeness. Not because you're weak, because the human brain bonds through shared emotion, especially when it comes with exclusivity. I've never told anyone this. You're the only one who gets me. You're different. Those lines don't just feel romantic. They create a role. They make you the healer. They make you the Akeller. They make you the exception. And once you're in that role, leaving doesn't feel like leaving a relationship. It feels like abandoning someone you saved. That's why it hurts in a very specific way. You don't just miss him. You miss the meaning you attached to the bond. You miss the identity you became inside it. The woman who could love someone back to life. Now notice how this connects to guilt. Narcissistic vulnerability is often used to generate guilt at exactly the moment you start waking up. The moment you say, "This isn't okay," he becomes fragile. He suddenly remembers his trauma. He suddenly talks about how no one stays. He suddenly talks about how no one stays. He suddenly says, "I'm trying," and your heart tightens because you don't want to be cruel. You don't want to be the person who leaves someone when they're struggling. So you soften your boundary. You take your truth and fold it into a smaller shape so he can tolerate it. And that moment when you shrink your truth to protect his feelings is where attachment deepens. Because you just taught your nervous system something. His pain matters more than my clarity. And when that becomes the emotional rule, you will feel guilty every time you prioritize yourself. Even when you're doing something healthy, that's one of the most painful after effects women describe. They finally set a boundary, and instead of feeling proud, they feel sick with guilt. That guilt didn't come from nowhere. It was conditioned through vulnerability. Now let's talk about the specific manipulations that often hide behind the vulnerable presentation. One is the sob story that preemptively disarms you. He tells you how his ex was crazy, how his family is toxic, how people always betray him, how he can't trust anyone. At first it feels like he's opening up, but it also installs an idea in your mind. Other people hurt him, and he's the victim. So later, when you notice him lying or being cruel, your mind goes back to that story. Maybe he's acting this way because he's been hurt. Maybe he's scared. Maybe he's testing if I'll leave like everyone else. And suddenly, you're not looking at his behavior with clear eyes. You're looking at it through a lens of sympathy. That sympathy is not wrong. But in this dynamic, it's used to protect him from consequences. Another manipulation is future vulnerability. He doesn't just share pain, he shares potential. He tells you what he wants to become. He paints a picture of the man he will be. I want a family. I want to be better. I'm working on myself. I've never felt like this with anyone. And you attach to the future version of him. So you endure the present version. That's how false hope becomes attachment. Because as long as you are bonded to who he could be, you will keep excusing who he is. Then there's vulnerable rage. He claims he's hurt, so his anger becomes justified. He says, "I reacted because I care. I got jealous because I love you. I snapped because you triggered my abandonment." And now his harm is framed as evidence of depth. So you're not only tolerating bad behavior, you're interpreting it as love. That's one of the most disorienting switches that can happen inside a woman. Because love is supposed to feel safe. But in this dynamic, love is trained to feel like tension. Then there's the most subtle one. Vulnerability used as a shield against accountability. When you bring up something he did, he doesn't address it. He collapses. He becomes sad, quiet, wounded, he says. "I guess I'm just broken. I'm a terrible person. You deserve better." And you rush to reassure him, "No, you're not terrible. That's not what I'm saying. I don't want to hurt you." And now, once again, his emotional state becomes the center. your original concern disappears. This why women leave conversations feeling like they can never get resolution, because vulnerability is being used to end the conversation without repair. It's a smokescreen, not always intentionally performed, but effectively used. And when you're an empathetic woman, you will always choose compassion in the moment, unless you're grounded enough to recognize the pattern. So what does this do to you internally? It creates emotional confusion because you're constantly toggling between two realities. Reality one, he can be so soft, so wounded, so human. Reality two, he can be so cold, so cruel, so dismissive. And your mind keeps trying to reconcile the two, because humans cannot tolerate cognitive dissonance for long, so you create explanations to make it make sense. It's because he's stressed. It's because he didn't sleep. It's because he is afraid. It's because he is afraid. It's because he had trauma. Those explanations aren't stupid. They're your brain trying to create a coherent story so you can stay attached without feeling insane. But the cost of that story is your self-trust. Because once you start explaining away harm, you start doubting your own boundaries. You start thinking you're too strict, too sensitive, too demanding, and you become emotionally exhausted. Not just from what he does, but from the internal labor of translating harm into meaning. That labor is invisible, but it drains you. Now here's a turning point insight that often brings relief. The difference between genuine vulnerability and manipulative vulnerability is reciprocity and repair. Genuine vulnerability makes a person more responsible, not less. It leads to humility. It leads to behavior change. It leads to repair. It makes room for your pain too. Manipulative vulnerability makes you responsible for the person's feelings while they remain unaccountable for their behavior. It makes you the container for their emotions, while your emotions become too much. This is why you may have felt deeply bonded, but also deeply lonely, because intimacy wasn't mutual. It was one-way caretaking disguised as closeness. And if you're realizing that now, you might feel a rush of grief. Grief for how much you gave. Grief for how much you gave. Grief for how sincerely you tried. Grief for how you held his pain while your pain went unattended. That grief doesn't mean you made a mistake loving. It means you're waking up to the shape of what happened. Now, what do you do with this in a way that feels emotionally safe and not like a harsh command? You start by separating empathy from obligation. Empathy means you can understand someone's pain. Obligation is when you feel responsible for fixing it, carrying it, or sacrificing your reality for it. In narcissistic dynamics, those two get fused together. You feel like if you understand him, you must stay. If you see his trauma, you must tolerate the harm. If you know he's wounded, you must accept the inconsistency. But empathy does not require self-erasure. And once that lands, your nervous system begins to relax because you stop treating your compassion as a contract. Another gentle direction is learning to notice what happens inside you when he becomes vulnerable. Do you feel pulled to rescue? Do you feel guilty for having boundaries? Do you feel like you have to soften your truth? That internal pull is not a sign that you should give in. It's a sign that a familiar pattern is activating, and noticing it is how you regain choice. A third shift is to stop evaluating a relationship by how deep the conversations are, and start evaluating it by how safe you feel afterward. Narcissistic partners can be incredibly emotionally articulate when it serves them. They can cry, confess, talk about trauma, talk about growth. But after the tears, does your life become calmer? After the confession, does your nervous system feel safe? After the apology, does the behavior change? If not, then the vulnerability is not creating intimacy. It's creating attachment. Attachment can feel like love, but it often feels like anxiety. You're always scanning, always waiting, always hoping. And if you've lived that, you know how exhausting it is to love someone who keeps you in suspense. Another emotionally grounding perspective is to treat vulnerability as information, not as proof. It can be true that he has pain. It can be true that he suffered. It can also be true that he uses that pain in ways that harm you. Those truths can exist together. You don't have to deny his wounds to protect yourself. He simply stopped letting his wounds cancel out your reality. Because your pain matters too. Your fatigue matters. Your confusion matters. And a relationship that keeps demanding your empathy while punishing your needs is not intimacy, it's emotional extraction. Now, the need for closure is often what keeps women stuck. You want him to admit the truth. You want him to acknowledge that he used his vulnerability to pull you in. You want him to say, I was wrong, but narcissistic dynamics rarely give clean closure. They give emotion, they give stories, they give tears. They don't give accountability, so the closure that heals is internal. It's the moment you stop asking, was it real? And you begin asking, what did it do to me? Did it bring safety? Did it create mutual care? Did it lead to repair? Or did it keep you bound to a cycle where you were always the one holding everything? That question returns you to your own life. And returning to your own life is the beginning of emotional freedom from narcissistic attachment. Because the deepest injury in these relationships isn't just being hurt, it's being pulled away from yourself. Your instincts get muted. Your clarity gets foggy, your needs feel shameful, your boundaries feel cruel. So the path forward is not becoming cold, it's becoming anchored. Anchored in patterns, anchored in how your body feels, anchored in what happens over time. And as you become anchored, something beautiful happens quietly. You start to feel less hypnotized by the performance of softness. You start to care less about the story and more about the reality you live in. You begin to recognize that real love doesn't need you to be a therapist. Real love doesn't recruit your empathy to excuse harm. Real love does not make you feel guilty for needing basic care. And you don't have to force yourself to believe that. You feel it when you finally experience steadiness. When you can speak without fear. When you can be hurt without being punished. When you can have needs without being mocked. When your reality isn't constantly on trial. If you've been attached to a narcissist through vulnerability, it makes sense that leaving, or even detaching emotionally, can feel like abandoning someone wounded. But what you're actually doing is ending a role you were quietly assigned, the one who carries his pain while yours stays unheld. And when you step out of that role, you don't lose your compassion. You reclaim it. You reclaim it for yourself first. You become the person who can finally say, without anger and without apology, I can understand what happened to you and still honor what happened to me. And that sentence, when it becomes real inside you, changes everything. Because then your empathy stops being a leash. It becomes wisdom. And wisdom doesn't keep you attached to harm. It brings you back home to yourself. Steadier, clearer, less alone. Like something finally made sense.